Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ron Lyons, the Vice President of the Society, and I'm standing in for our President, Rob Musker, who is somewhere in France on the Western Front. Welcome to our October lecture. A couple of administrative points. If you have mobile phones, could you please turn them off or to silent? The toilet facilities are out the doors behind us and to the left. And if we have to evacuate the building for any reason, it's again out the doors behind us, to your right, and up to the ramp to the water cascade feature on Liverpool Street. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to welcome some new members to the Society. And the latest group includes Vince Champion, Hamish Robertson, Roberta Conroy, and Chris Bryant. I'd also like to remind you about our proposed Greece and Crete tour in 2025. We're still taking expressions of interest, and there are forms and a registration sheet on the reception desk outside. To date, we have 11 people who've indicated that they wish to take part in it, but our costings are based on 20, so we need more people to keep the pricing that we've got. Our speaker today is John Morrison, and his subject is the Peninsula campaign of the American Civil War. The equation changes, March to July 1862. John is one of our members. He served in the Royal Australian Army Medical Corps as a reservist for 25 years. He's also a member of the Company of Military Historians and is the Program Director of the Sydney chapter of the American Civil War Round Table. His talk will show us how a bold strategic concept and plan to attack the enemy's capital city and end the war failed due to the lack of willpower and tactical appreciation by the Union commander and the resilience of the Confederate Army that he faced. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome John Morrison to the podium.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Oh, good, thank God for that. The late and much remembered Jim Mullen said to me one time, the trouble with you medics is you're all just frustrated commanders. And I suspect he was probably pretty right. What I want to do today is to look at one of the key campaigns of the Civil War, certainly the early stages, the defining campaign in the early stages, the campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond by means of an advance up the Yorktown Peninsula. We'll talk about that, and also about the use of diversion, the tactical approach that was taken, especially combined operations, Army and Navy, which was something that was relatively new, the emergence of new tactics, the emergence of new commanders, and ultimately the change in the nature of the war and in the pattern of the aggressive campaign that the Union realised that they were going to have to win. The American Civil War, as most people know, it really dated back to, well, some people would say that it dated back to the Revolutionary War and to the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It really was given a major impetus during the Mexican War when the US acquired a large amount of new territory. And as it admitted new states, there were conflicts over whether they were to be admitted as free or slave states. This started a lot of conflicts about states' rights, which exist in the US to this day. The 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, who pledged not, as many people believe, to abolish slavery, but merely to prevent the expansion of slavery into the new states and new territories. This led to the secession of 13 southern states and ultimately to the armed conflict as we know it as the Civil War. Now, when the war emerged, 19th century military strategy maintained that you had to have three main strategies when you fought a war. Firstly, you destroyed your enemy's army in a great battle or battles. Secondly, you seized strategic sites or sites of strategic importance. And thirdly, you captured your enemy's capital. There were two other strategies that were used in what became, or is today deemed as total warfare. This was a new emergence in the Civil War, and that was to destroy your enemy's economy and infrastructure and his ability to make war, and secondly, to break the will of the people to continue a war. So this was kind of the emergence. You know, people often say, was the Civil War the last old war, or was the first modern war? It was a transition really between the old and the new. And that applied at all levels, including the weaponry and the tactics. So the North evolved, right from the start, the North evolved a threefold strategy known as the Anaconda Plan, which most people here would probably have heard of. And they never really wavered from it. They did a round of other things, but it was primarily this campaign that remained. That was firstly the blockading of the southern ports to strangle the import and export of goods and earning of income, etc. To send the Western Army to secure the border states in the Mississippi Valley and essentially to sever the Confederacy in two, to cut the Eastern Confederacy off from supplies of men and material from the West. And thirdly, to send an Eastern Army to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, which was vital to the Confederacy, meant that they would have to defend it, and therefore it would probably lead to the Great Battle, you know, that would end up destroying, in inverted commas, the Confederate Army. Didn't quite work out like that. Now the South, because they had never really expected a full-blown war, I mean some of the hotheads did, but the more sensible people didn't want a full-blown war. They just thought, a bit of an armed conflict and we'll have a few riots, we'll fire a few shots, we'll do a deal and it'll all be over by the shouting. So they didn't really start off with a general strategy. When the states seceded, many of them envisaged staying as independent units. The concept of a confederacy was kind of only really something that evolved and came to encompass the seceding states. So their strategy, which evolved and was kind of might have worked, but what they decided to do was to protect their territory, to wear down Union forces through defensive battles rather than invading and conquering the North. That was something they didn't stick to, and the consequences were genuinely disastrous. To outlast Union political or civilian will to persist with the war, and they came pretty close on a couple of occasions to succeeding with that, and also to seek foreign recognition, which they also came perilously close to. The first major battle, July 1861, was First Manassas, or Bull Run, which was a humiliating defeat for the Union. Most people know that. Neither army really knew what they were doing, and the Confederates were sort of as disorganised from victory as the Union was from defeat. In fact, Jackson said later on, after that battle, that he could have probably taken Washington if he'd been able to sort of coordinate an attack amongst the Confederate units. Thus emerged this man, one of the most controversial figures of the Civil War, somebody that everybody studies, somebody that I personally detest, as both a person and as a commander, George Quinton McClellan, or Little Mac. He was a graduate of West Point in 1846, second in his class. He was only 19 when he graduated. He served with distinction during the Mexican War on Winfield Scott's staff, and under the tutelage of a man called Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. He then became an observer of the Crimean War. He wrote the Army Manual on Cavalry Tactics, and he designed a saddle, the McClellan saddle, which many of you have probably heard of. It's used to this day. It's so good. So he was a man of extraordinary accomplishment. He left the army, he was appointed to the 2nd Cavalry, which was the elite unit of the US Army at the time, under Albert Sidney Johnson and Robert E. Lee. But he has one of its youngest troop commanders. But he left in 1856 to take up an appointment as a railroad vice president at 30 years of age, on a salary that in today's dollars would have been well in excess of $1.5 million a year. So, a man of great accomplishment. Extraordinarily intelligent, and unfortunately, I think he suffered from that because he'd always been the smartest man in any room he was in. And like a lot of very highly intelligent people, he always thought he knew better than everyone else. And he didn't. Certainly when he took over as the commander, he was brought from the Ohio militia, where he'd been serving as a major general of reserves, if you like, he was brought over to take command of the Union forces in and around Washington. And he created the Army of the Potomac. He was also, at the same time, appointed essentially the Chief of Staff for the US Army. He built a magnificent army, there's no question about that. Whatever else, he was an extraordinarily effective organiser, very good staff officer, very good at logistics when he chose to be. And he built an army, he built training, he laid out camps, he built training facilities, he established training programs for junior officers. He appointed a number of very effective commanders. Many of the commanders in the Union Army at that time were political appointees. He appointed men who did have experience in the regular army. So men like, for example, the great Winfield Scott Hancock, who was serving as a quartermaster. He immediately said, well, you're wasted as a quartermaster, Winfield, and so he appointed him as a brigade commander, and then division and later corps commander at Antietam. So he certainly had some strengths. He built this magnificent army. He also basically fortified Washington. Washington became the most fortified city on the face of the earth. But by late 1861, there was no indication of how or when he was going to strike at the Confederacy. And Abraham Lincoln, who I absolutely loved Lincoln, but he always had a way of being able to summarise things with just a sort of a quip or a casual command. And he basically remarked to one of his aides, look, if General McClellan's not using the Army of the Potomac, would he mind if I borrowed it for a little while? So, he pressed him to come up with a plan of action against the Confederate capital, and what emerged was the Peninsula Campaign. He believed, probably justifiably, that Richmond held the fate of the Confederacy, but he didn't want to march directly at Richmond from Washington. Bearing in mind, and a lot of people to this day don't realise, they're only about 150 kilometres apart. They're very close together. And there are several routes to Richmond. The most direct from Washington is across what's known as the Wilderness. And those of you who know about the Wilderness Campaign of 1864, McClellan said he didn't want to march against it because he was frightened of the severe casualties that they might take from the Wilderness, because the Confederates would know how to use that defensively. Guess what? In 1864, when Grant began with his overland campaign, that's exactly what happened. So it wasn't an entirely crazy idea to look for another route. Initially, he said, well, let's just put our army between the Confederate forces in Virginia and Richmond by way of Urbana on the Rappahannock River, and in that way they will simply have to attack. They won't be able to surrender. We'll be able to take Richmond that way. But before he could put that plan into action, Joe Johnson pulled the Confederate army from Manassas back to Fredericksburg, which invalidated his plan. So he came up with the alternative plan, as I said, the Peninsula. Now, there's a couple of aspects to the Peninsula. Oh shit, what have I done? Okay. Couple of things about this. As I said, you can come overland, or you can move an army down amphibiouusly and then come up the York-James Peninsula. That's this peninsula between these two rivers. At the same time as you bring another arc down here for a pincer movement against Richmond. That's the Shenandoah Valley. And that's Hampton Roads. Both very important, and we'll see why. But essentially, that was the campaign itself that he came up with. As I said, it wasn't entirely a crazy idea. The big advantage that you would have is because, well, firstly, they had already held Fort Monroe at the tip of the York-James Peninsula, so the Union had taken that very early in the war. So it was already being used as a major base for Federal Fleet and Army operations, and therefore it was tailor-made to act as a headquarters, a jumping-off point, so to speak. So Joe Johnson's retreat meant that McClellan could use Fort Monroe as a base, and the Army of the Potomac, as he put it, could march against Richmond with complete security, although with less celebrity and brilliancy of results up the peninsula. He wasn't a man who was afraid to make a boastful claim. And it was sound strategy as well, too. One of the things was that with those two rivers, and because the peninsula is not that wide, you could use gunboats on either side as, if you like, flanking or support artillery. You could also, if you needed to, leapfrog strong points. as happened, for example, in Italy during the Second World War, and at various occasions during the Second World War. So, yeah, not a bad idea. A few limitations. One was the Chickahominy River, which runs roughly through the middle of the northern part of the peninsula near Richmond. There were only a certain number of limited fords and crossings. That meant that in certain occasions, the army was going to have to be divided. That was risky, especially against an opponent who knew the land and who knew how to use it. There was only one adequate supply line on the Upper Peninsula, and that was the Richmond and York River Railway. That became McClellan's lifeline. So this was another limitation. One of the things that I always think is interesting is when you look at the overland campaign that Grant made, people talk about the thousands of wagons, and, the wagon trains, the mule trains and so forth that accompanied his army, because he recognised that he had to carry enough provisions and enough equipment and enough material and supplies in order to wage that campaign. He had almost as many men in his logistics tail as he did fighting, which is a pattern that exists pretty much to this day. Getting the logistics tail sometimes longer than the fighting head. So, the terrain itself essentially lent itself to defence by a small force, especially one that knew the region well. And remember that a lot of the Confederates did. This was Confederate homeland. Many of them knew how to use a piece of topography and use it well. So that's the Peninsula campaign as it evolved. It started down here at Fort Monroe, came all the way up through Yorktown, Williamsburg, to the gates of Richmond. Then came the 7 Days, which forced the Union Army away and down to Harrison's Landing, from which they were eventually withdrawn. Let's have a look at some of the aspects of this in a bit more detail. The opposing forces, the Union forces, as I said, were under George McClellan. The Confederate commander was a man called Joseph Johnson. Now, he's heavily criticised by a lot of Civil War scholars, probably because he wasn't a particularly nice sort of a person, as compared to someone like Robert E. Lee or Pierre Beauregard or Albert Sidney Johnson. He wasn't a particularly easy person to like. In fact, I think Robert E. Lee referred to him as his oiliness. He was the senior officer of the regular army to resign his commission and go south. He was a staff brigadier general. He was the quartermaster general of the Union Army, of the regular army. In other words, he was a brigadier general when Robert E. Lee was still a lieutenant colonel. And when people like Beauregard, I think, was a major. Albert Sidney Johnson was only a brevet brigadier general. And Sam Cooper, who was, what people don't even realise, was the senior officer of the Confederate Army throughout the whole war, was also only a full colonel. So he felt he should have been ranked as number 1 in the Confederate Army, and he wasn't. He was ranked as about number 4, I think. And he was ranked behind Robert E. Lee, who had been his classmate at West Point. And he really resented that. And it led to a lot of hostility between him and Jefferson Davis, the Confederate commander. He pouted at it, he sulked about it. Really not very nice. And it's a shame because his performance as a general in the field, especially I think on fighting delaying or defensive campaigns, he was without peer. He was one of the best on either side at doing that sort of thing. But as I said, not a particularly nice or likeable sort of a person. Look at the size of the armies. You had, McClellan had 3 corps under Sumner, Heinlein and Keyes, strength of about 120,000. So they were a big army corps for the time. Johnson had essentially 2 corps, that is one under Daniel Harvey Hill and the other under James Longstreet. D.H. Hill should not be confused with A.P. Hill, who was one of the corps commanders at Gettysburg and one of the senior corps commanders in Lee's army. He was only a division commander at this stage. But so you have Daniel Harvey Hill and James Longstreet, and then you have a much smaller force under John Magruder. Magruder is an important figure in this campaign, and it's the only thing I've ever been able to find out that was important about his whole life or his whole career. That's the Union Army, the Union commanders. What's immediately obvious is that McClellan was so much younger than his corps commanders. In fact, Most of them had been senior to him in the regular army. You can imagine that didn't always sit particularly well with them. And that's Joe Johnson, along with Daniel Harvey Hill, James Longstreet, Old Pete, who was to be the longest serving corps commander of the Confederate Army, and I would argue their best. Pete Longstreet's a bit of a friend of mine, a bit of a favourite of mine. I always had a penchant for him. And then John Magruder. His nickname was Prince John, and you can probably see why. He was a West Point graduate, an engineer. He was much given to amateur theatrics, and he was going to have plenty of occasion to use that skill, as we'll see. Before McClellan could get moving, this happened. Hampton Roads is one of the most famous naval engagements in history. It was the first clash of ironclads, the Monitor and the Virginia, sometimes falsely called the Merrimack. The Virginia basically cruised up to Hampton Roads, destroyed 2 Union warships in one day, and for one day the Confederate Navy ruled the seas. Lincoln regarded this as an enormous Union calamity, the greatest since Bull Run. Edward Stanton, the Secretary of War, feared that Virginia was going to steam up and attack the federal capital. They were aware that she existed, and that was why they asked for the Monitor to be built. And Erickson, the great inventor who developed the Monitor, said that this was a revolutionary design that would neutralise the Virginia's great strengths, and she kind of did. They fought to a standstill. Neither was able to destroy the others. Now, a lot of people say, well, yes, strategically the Union won because the Virginia had to withdraw, but she kind of didn't. What she did was, she fell back to a base at the mouth of the James River, and while she was there, she offered a threat that delayed and altered McClellan's campaign. Very reminiscent of those German battleships that used to sit in the Norwegian fields. They didn't move, they didn't do anything, but the British, the Royal Navy, had to keep them covered. And that's exactly what happened here. They could never be sure that they might not move. So you can argue, a lot of people do argue about the tactics and the strategy of that battle, but that's something that gets missed. It had a major consequence on his campaign. Confident the Monitor could hold them off, McClellan proceeded with his campaign and started shipping 120,000 men, supplies, armaments, etc. to Fort Monroe on the 17th of March. And he accomplished that movement in less than a month. Remarkable logistic achievement. And probably the most remarkable achievement of his campaign, sadly. It was the biggest army to conduct an amphibious operation in North America in history. It was bigger than, in fact, the Union Army at the time was bigger than any Confederate city. So they effectively moved the biggest city in the Confederacy down here to Fort Monroe. Confederate prospects were looking pretty bleak at this stage because Ambrose Burnside's troops will finalise the conquest of eastern North Carolina. Union forces appeared to be invincible along the Mississippi River, and the Great Battle of Shiloh was to come shortly after, and it was a terrible and bloody battle, but it was a Union victory and forced the Union out of western Tennessee for good. Southerners feared that if Richmond fell, the Confederacy might collapse, and it probably would have. It was the only really significant industrial base and the only really significant city, I would argue, in the upper Confederacy that they really had. Confederate hopes therefore were pinned on the Virginia holding Hampton Roads and on General Magruder with his small army of the Peninsula, which was an understrength division, delaying the Union forces' move towards Richmond. Now, Magruder, so McClellan started to move up the peninsula. He occupied abandoned Confederate works at Big Bethel and Young's Mill, but they were slowed by heavy rains. This was again the first indication that they hadn't probably done as much reconnaissance or as much intelligence gathering as they perhaps should have. The army was blocked by Magruder, who firstly constructed a magnificent series of entrenchments to prevent the movement or slow the movement of the Union Army. But secondly, he also came up with a magnificent illusion of a powerful army. In fact, I would argue that it was every bit as effective as the illusionary campaign of Maskelyne in North Africa in 41, 42 and 43. I often wondered if Maskelyne might have actually studied Magruder, because he did the same sort of things. He would parade one regiment through a gap in the trees, you know, round and round in a circle, so it looked like it was a whole corps. He got tree trunks and painted them, dressed them up to look like gun emplacements, all these sorts of things, and sort of ran wagons up and down along the road, so it looked as if a mighty force had been up through there. There'd probably only been sort of, you know, a few wagon trains. Very, very clever. Deception, camouflage, concealment. Again, it's quite a modern concept really, but a very clever one and very effective. So, that was the first thing. So, the plans for a rapid movement past Yorktown were upset by the Confederate defences. Also by Lincoln's decision not to release Irvin McDowell's very large First Corps, which was effectively almost as big as an army. We'll talk about why in a minute. The US Navy also refused to support McClellan's forces because they were frightened about the Virginia. So they held their ships back. And McClellan's own reconnaissance, I said, his reconnaissance, his intelligence was appallingly bad. And he suddenly believed he was facing an army of 250,000. Where the Confederacy would have got an army of 250,000, nobody knows. But that was what he believed. That was what he convinced himself of. So came the siege of Yorktown. Not a particularly sophisticated battle. In fact, none of the Peninsula battles really were particularly sophisticated. He basically just maintained this siege for 2 weeks and essentially tried to break it and sort of, edged to and fro. There was poor coordination on both sides when they did try to breach. Essentially, Johnson realised that if it deteriorated into a siege, then it would ultimately, the outcome would be inevitable. So he said, right, hang on as long as we can, and then we'll just withdraw. We'll tie them up, we'll hold them up, and then we'll withdraw back to our next prepared position. And that's exactly what he did. McClellan, of course, claimed that was a great victory. In fact, he said, it was marvellous, what a wonderful victory this was. Then came Williamsburg. Pretty much the same sort of thing. The Confederates withdrew, McClellan sent Heintzelman with orders to follow the Confederate army, while Johnson planned to delay the Union pursuit, and so they clashed. This engagement here, under Union forces under Joe Hooker, attacking the Confederate lines near Fort Magruder, outside Williamsburg. If you look at the commanders there, Hooker, Longstreet, Kearney, Cooch, Hancock, Early, most of them went on to become corps and even army commanders on both sides. So this was kind of like the crucible in which several of the more senior commanders, that's what makes it a significant battle. This is where several of the senior commanders got their first experience at battle. At nightfall, the Confederates again abandoned the field, but the engagement had bought time for the main army to continue their withdrawal beyond Williamsburg. McClellan himself didn't arrive until after dark. To be fair, he was off in Yorktown supervising the embarkation of Franklin and his move up the York River. He was intending to do, as I said, to basically leapfrog around and block Johnson's withdrawal to Richmond. But unfortunately, Franklin's moves were so timid, they were reminiscent of McClellan himself, that nothing eventuated from that. The casualty rate for Williamsburg and for the siege of Yorktown were relatively light, certainly by Civil War standards, very light, just over 5%. Lincoln was starting to get pretty disillusioned here, and so he basically came up and he said to McClellan, look, you don't seem to be doing much. Can you please get on with it? Now, McClellan had complete contempt for Lincoln. He really did. Anybody know what he used to call Lincoln? The gorilla. Pretty close, yeah. He used to call him the gorilla because he reckoned he almost viewed him as being almost subhuman because, he came from the West. He was a coarse, rough man. He didn't have anything like the education and the sophistication and the bearing and the breeding that McClellan did. There's a famous story that at one stage Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward went to visit McClellan at his home in Washington, And one evening, anyway, they said that they were coming and wanted to went there. They were shown into the parlour. They sat there for half an hour, and eventually the servant came in and said, "I'm terribly sorry, but General McClellan has gone to bed. He says he'll see you tomorrow." Now, you know, I mean, really, and when he used to, you know, when he used to sort of, he would write to his commanders saying, "The President came to me and said that we should breach such and such alliance," he said. Well, I was sorely tempted to tell him he should go out and do it himself, type of thing. I mean, really contemptuous stuff, and Lincoln should have sacked him, because he was at the very least guilty of gross insubordination. But he felt he didn't have anyone else, and so he just had to persist with it. The Confederate Army was now in retreat back towards Richmond. Lincoln wanted to open the James River, the only obstacle being Virginia, which fortunately now, he basically directed Flag Officer Goldsborough and General Wool to end the Virginia's control of Hampton roads by occupying its base, figuring correctly that without its base it couldn't operate, and that's exactly what happened. They had to withdraw. Virginia couldn't manoeuvre or steam up the James to Richmond, so she was scuttled. Sad end for a very effective warship. And finally, the gates of Richmond. The Union fleet, which included now the ironclads Galena and Monitor, slowly moved up the river, but the delay had been effective because the Confederates had, in the nick of time, been able to construct defences on Drewry's Bluff. So they could, and that's kind of a lithograph that pictures what they could see and how they could rain fire, especially plunging shot, down on the Union fleet as it came up. They severely damaged a couple of the ironclads, and so they said, "We better get the hell out of here." And so they pulled back. So McClellan was delayed yet again. Despite the repulse given to the Union fleet, his army was at the outskirts of the Confederate capital, and the Confederates knew that if it became a siege, then it was only going to end one way, and that was with the fall of Richmond. So he had established a major new supply base near West Point. That's not the West Point military academy, West Point in northern Virginia. And he was ready to invest Richmond with siege artillery. Reinforcements had enabled him to establish 2 new corps, so he now had 5. But his delays on the peninsula were altered by this campaign, Jackson's Valley campaign. One of the most famous campaigns in history. Remember that the Peninsula Campaign called for a simultaneous advance by McClellan's army and McDowell's army to advance from Richmond from the north to capture the Confederate capital of Peninsula, which it probably wouldn't have been able to defend. But the vigorous offensive in the Shenandoah Valley by this man here, on the left, Stonewall Jackson, put paid to that. Stonewall Jackson is one of the most remarkable commanders in history. I'm sure just about everybody here has heard of him, studied him. He was extensively studied in the late 19th and 20th century by a young engineer from Melbourne called John Monash. He was studied by a couple of young Prussian obersts called Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein in the 20s and 30s. He was also studied by a school teacher from South London called William Slew. He was extensively studied by men like Patton, Bradley, Montgomery. Yeah, even Montgomery thought it was worth reading about. Somebody must have been good because he wasn't Montgomery. And for Montgomery to acknowledge that anyone was worth studying, apart from himself, was quite something. But yeah, one of the most extraordinary commanders in history. I love that picture of him actually, because that's pretty much the way he was. He's very badly portrayed in movies, in paintings, in statues, etc. He's always portrayed as this magnificent, sententious, martial figure, standing there in a dress uniform, astride a mighty steed, looking like a master horseman. But the worst portrayal of him ever was in a truly ghastly movie called Gods and Generals, which I'm sure some of you have seen. It's a truly awful movie. Stephen Lang's a great actor, don't get me wrong, but his portrayal of Jackson is completely wrong. Jackson, look at his uniform. Rumpled, creased, buttons missing, his hair's dishevelled, He doesn't look much like a general. In fact, at one stage, Jeb Stewart, the cavalry commander, sent him a dress frock coat with gold braid and so forth. He said, for heaven's sake, you're one of the most famous generals we've got. You should at least look the part. He wore a crumpled, rumpled old hat. He sat a horse, as one of his men said, like a sack of meal. And his horse, Little Sorrel, wasn't a magnificent stallion. He was a wiry little Morgan.
No, you're on the left or on the right?
That's Jackson there, on the left. On the right is Joe Johnson, his boss. The man on the left up the top here is Irvin McDowell, and then of course that's George McClellan. You look at those three compared to Jackson, they're all standing there in martial stance with beautifully puffed, beautifully tailored uniforms and very martial stance and so forth. Not Jackson. Jackson was a true eccentric in every sense of the word. He was a bit of a religious zealot. His men, contrary to popular belief, did not love him. Most of them thought he was crazy, and they really resented the fact that he demanded 10, 15-mile marches in a day. In fact, his infantry came to call themselves foot cavalry, because that's what they reckoned they were like. They were travelling the same distance as the cavalry. They might as well have been called cavalry. In spite of that, they were willing to follow him because he was an exceptional commander and he brought them victory after victory. He did waver once during the 7 days, as a matter of fact, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. But overall, one of the most effective and extraordinary commanders in history, and somebody who's still studied, as I said, in military academies and staff colleges throughout the world to this very day. Oh, I've done it again. There we go. The Shenandoah Valley, for those of you who don't know, is the valley between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Allegheny Mountains in the east and the west. That's out. Yeah. There it is, yeah. So, that's it there. A Northern army entering Virginia, coming down through here, could be subjected to flank attacks through gaps across the Blue Ridge Mountains. It also offered a very well-protected avenue for Confederate armies if they wanted to invade the North. In fact, that's the route that Lee took in the Gettysburg campaign and General Early took in his Gully campaign of 1864. So very important strategically. And, of course, it was the breadbasket of the Confederacy. It was vital to the Confederacy as a supply of agricultural material, wheat, about 20% of the total wheat crop of Virginia, livestock, and you name it. So if the Union could reach Staunton in the Upper Valley, they would then threaten the vital Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, which was the only link between Richmond and the Mississippi. And Samuel Jackson wrote, if the valley is lost, then Virginia is lost. Now Jackson was a man of the valley. That's where he came from. And so did many of the men in his command. What do you reckon was the first thing he did? He said to a map maker called Jebediah Hotchkiss, make me a map of the valley from Harper's Ferry to Lexington showing all points of offence and defence in all those places. And that's exactly what he did. If anyone's ever seen this map, it's well worth seeing, actually. Over there. Sorry, it wasn't over there. Oh. If anyone's ever seen that map, which sits in fact in the Confederate archives in Richmond, it is 1.5 by 3 metres, very large. And he consulted with his men, many of whom, as I said, came from the valley, and he got as much information as he could. So he had this very detailed, large map, and he had all the information that none of his opponents did. So he knew exactly where to go, exactly where to attack, exactly how to move his troops. And that's exactly what he did. His forces, it says there 5,000 to 17,000. In point of fact, he never really had effectively more than about 7,000 or 8,000 men. It was his own division and the division of Richard Ewell, Baldy Ewell, who was to end up succeeding him as corps commander, as the commander of the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, the man who is sometimes, wrongly in my opinion, credited with having lost the Battle of Gettysburg. Ewell was one of those people who was an extraordinary division commander, probably the best in the Confederate Army. But when promoted the next level up to corps command, he faltered badly. And that is true of many commanders in the Civil War, that they commanded brilliantly at one level, moved them the next level up, and they just faltered. They couldn't make that transition. The Union forces were commanded by these three men, Irvin McDowell, Nathaniel Banks and John Fremont, arguably three of the worst commanders that the Union Army produced, and that's really saying something. But all three of them had major faults and failures. Jackson, that's him, and then some of his commanders below him. But again, very small, very mobile force. And what he did was, if you have a look there, his Confederates in red advanced down the Shenandoah Valley, or north. They fought Shields Federals in blue at Kernstown. Then he retreated up the valley, or south, to link up with Ewell, before moving west into the mountains to fight the Federals at McClellan. Again, he entered the valley from the west, advanced north to fight Banks at Front Royal in Winchester, returned south to cross Keys and Port Republic, and then left the valley of the east. He did all of that. I mean, it was all snatch and grab. There's nothing particularly sophisticated. They were all quick attacks, attacks of opportunism. And there's the figures from the overall campaign. So you've got the total casualties, about 11.6%, 16% for the Confederates, 10% for the Union, probably exaggerated slightly by the fact that the Confederate force was quite small. But really, a truly brilliant campaign, because what it did was, whilst McClellan had deployed his army of more than 100,000 men outside Richmond, they dangerously straddled the Chickahominy River. So we had 3 corps north of the river and 2 south. And south of the river, the Confederates actually outnumbered the Union forces 2-1. And the forces that he had wanted to bring from Washington and from further west to the Peninsula were denying him because of Jackson's Valley campaign, because it kept the Union so off balance that they weren't going to remove forces from Washington. The Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, which was almost the final act of the Richmond campaign, began late at the very end of May, when basically the Confederates drove heavily into Keyes' 4th Corps and inflicted heavy casualties. Reinforcements arrived from Heintzelman's Corps to support Keyes and hold the Union left. A mile north of Seven Pines, Confederate divisions of Whiting attacked the Federal right in Fair Oaks and Richmond and on the Richmond and York Railroad. The Union lines were only really stabilised when General Edward Sumner's 2nd Corps reinforcements crossed the Chickahominy over what became known as the Great Vine Bridge. That is the bridge that they constructed. He had a very good corps of engineers working for him, and they were able to do that in no time. But Joe Johnson was very severely wounded. The command of the Confederate Army devolved temporarily, at least, to Gustavus Smith. So, early on the 1st of June, the next day, the Confederates renewed their assault, but they kind of lost their momentum by this stage with the loss of their commander. There was a lot of skirmishing. There were several senior officers, including Oliver Howard from the Union Army, who were very badly injured. Some of them taken out of action for 7 months. Joe Hooker's 3rd Division attacked the Confederates as they withdrew, and that ended the 2 days fighting. And it was a bit of a stalemate. Both sides claimed victory. It was a bit of a stalemate, really, and it's hard to see it actually which side did. So there was a 16% casualty rate here. But now the equation changed, because with Johnson's wounding, Davis selected his military advisor, General Robert E. Lee, to replace him. Now, that wasn't universally welcomed at the time. Some people, like one of Davis's aides, thought this might be hailed as a harbinger of a bright fortune. Mainly they thought, well, Johnson's such an awful person to try and deal with. I mean, Lee is a gentleman at least, and therefore it will be easy to deal with him. But by the end of the month, Lee had initiated the 7 days battles, which will be one of the last things we look at, leading to the Union retreat from the gates of Richmond. One first thing he did, however, was he got his cavalry commander, Jeb Stewart, sent him out to reconnoitre the Union right flank, and Stewart confirmed that yes, the Union right flank was up in the air, so to speak. They hadn't entrenched, they hadn't dug in on their right flank. That was not the first and wouldn't be the last time that the Army of the Potomac made that mistake. They made it at Chancellorsville a year later with the same disastrous consequences. Meanwhile, however, And this, of course, prompted Lee to bring Jackson and his men up from the valley to oppose that flank and sort of said, attack that and weaken Constantine and turn the flank. Stuart, meanwhile, now Stuart is sometimes, he's a colourful, flamboyant figure. A lot of people consider him an exhibitionist and a poseur, which he was. And he decided to go off and ride all the way around the Union Army, get his name in the papers and so forth. A lot of people, again, to this day, misjudge Stuart's ride around the Union Army. What he was really doing was to keep them off balance. Because if you think about it, he was showing them that he could move anywhere, pop up at any time, and fight them any place. And all of this played into the psychology of McClellan, who by this stage was starting to get really paranoid about men like Jackson and Stuart. So that unsettled him and helped convince him that he was severely outnumbered. He thought that Stuart had 3 times the number of cavalry that he did. So, at last we come to the ultimate campaign. Oops, where am I? The 7 days. So, McClellan, as we said, campaign had failed. He hadn't taken Richmond. He was at the outskirts, the Battle of 7 Pines Fair Oaks, ended in stalemate. Johnson was wounded and Lee became his replacement. Lee spent a few weeks extending his defensive lines, reorganising the new Army of Northern Virginia into essentially 2 corps, the first under Longstreet, the second under Stonewall Jackson. McClellan stayed passively to his front, reliably as always, doing nothing. And as somebody said, only McClellan could have done that. Only McClellan could have sat there and done nothing. Lee had no numerical superiority over McClellan, but instead, contradicting military theory and military practice then and now, he determined to attack in a position of inferiority. And it only took him 7 days to completely outfight General McClellan and to reverse the Union advance. So it had taken McClellan almost 3 months to reach Richmond. It took him just 7 days to lose all the ground he gained. He fell back all the way here to Harrison's Landing, where he sat for a couple of weeks before Lincoln said, well, if you're not going to do anything, there's no point in you sitting there, and withdrew the army from the Peninsula. Lincoln can be criticised for that as well too, because that was kind of throwing the baby out of the bathwater, so to speak. Opposing forces, again, you had well over 100,000 forces under McClellan. About the same number. This was the largest army that the Confederates ever put into the field. As I said, it was mainly made up of Stonewall Jackson's corps, Longstreet's corps, and then 3 smaller columns under Magruder, Huger, and Holmes. So between 25th of June and 1st of July, Lee launched a series of fierce counterattacks just east of Richmond. Now, none of them were significant Confederate tactical victories. In fact, several of them were fairly serious defeats. None of them was particularly sophisticated. They were all just a case of snatch and grab more than anything else. Just hurl men at one position and just try your best to do as much damage as you could. The tenacity of his attacks and the sudden appearance of Jackson's foot cavalry, as I said, on the western flank, unnerved McClellan, and he pulled his forces back, as I said, to the base on the James River. So on the 4th of August, Lincoln ordered the army to return to Washington. Those are the 7 days' battles. The total casualties, what's worth noting there is that the Confederate casualties were almost 1 in 5 men. Very, very high casualty rate. They didn't have a lot of troops to spare. The Union did. But as was the pattern with Lee, if you served under Lee in the Confederate Army, then 2 things were going to happen. A, you were going to go into battle, and B, you stood a pretty good chance of being killed or wounded. I should add, unlike a lot of Civil War buffs and people who studied the Civil War, I'm no great admirer of Lee. He was an effective commander, very fine commander in many ways, very fine tactical commander. But I don't think he deserves the almost sainted reputation that he has. So, an evaluation. McClellan's original plan for the Peninsula campaign wasn't an entirely stupid idea. It was actually sound strategy. Richmond was vital to the Confederacy. And the overall Peninsula campaign casualties were 23,000 Union and 30,000 Confederate, a rate of around 20 to 25%. Movement overland might have seen even higher casualties, and in fact it did when Grant did just that in 1864. The initial coordination of army and naval forces was effective, but it was disrupted, as we said, by Hampton, the Battle of Hampton Roads. The logistics applied to the movement of McClellan's army and a number of other things was excellent. Intelligence, however, especially on the Union side, was poor. And so was much of the tactical plan and what I would call the execution logistics. Johnson's phased withdrawal was an effective tactic, and it had a severe impact on Union morale, not just the army, but the civilian population as well. McClellan's caution denied the Union victory on at least 3 occasions. Somebody said one time, I remember hearing them say that McClellan never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So after a successful start, which foretold an early end to the war, Northern morale was completely crushed. Despite the fact that they were actually winning everywhere else, the war was very much going their way. Political interference, however justified, affected the overall outcome, and certainly the fact that the relationships between Presidents Lincoln and Davis and Generals McClellan and Johnson was so poor, ultimately affected the overall campaign on occasions. But new commanders emerged on both sides, and new approaches to warfare, especially tactical movement, also emerged. Confederate morale skyrocketed, and we were talking earlier on about, just before I started this presentation, Lee and the Confederacy got a rush of blood to the head and started to believe that they could actually win the war militarily, which anybody with any real insight knew they couldn't do. He was emboldened to continue that aggressive strategy, both at the Second Battle of Manassas and the Confederate invasion of the North, the Maryland campaign, which culminated in the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, in September. And by the way, the Civil War Roundtable is meeting this coming Tuesday night, and we're going to look at the Battle of Antietam, because it's a pivotal event in the Civil War. But it's pivotal for one other very important reason. Because Union victory at Antietam led to the Emancipation Proclamation. That changed the character of the war and the nation that would emerge forever. And that was the really significant thing. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We've got a limited amount of time for some questions. If you want, John?
On the commanders of the corps, one side had brigadier generals and the others had major generals. Why was such a discrepancy in corps commander?
Good question. The Confederacy, of course, had all 4 grades of general: brigadier, major general, lieutenant general, and full general. In the Union Army, there were only 2 grades of general at this stage: brigadier and major general. The Chief of Staff, Henry Hallett, was a major general. The Army commanders were major generals. The Corps commanders were major generals. The division commanders were major generals, ultimately. But that was one of the reasons why, because they had to be approved by Congress, there was only a limited number of men appointed to be generals in the Union Army. But it was a bit different in the Confederacy, where the President had the right to appoint and to fire.
It didn't change until Grant was given a 3rd star.
That's right. Grant,
Lieutenant General.
yes, that's right. Grant was an Army commander. He was made a Lieutenant General, so there would be no doubt. It caused problems, because you often had men who were sort of like Burnside, for example, was a Corps commander, yet he was senior to most of the Army commanders in terms of time and grade. And that caused a lot of problems, with command. So when Lincoln appointed Grant, he said, so there can be no doubt Grant was made a permanent Lieutenant General.
What happened to McClellan?
He sulked. He sulked for the next 18 months until he was nominated by the Democrats as the presidential candidate in 1864. It is said that the Army of the Potomac never gave greater service to the nation than in voting almost universally for Abraham Lincoln over their former commander. McClellan led one of the dirty, people talk about the grubby nature of American politics today. Go and have a look at the 1864 campaign. It was really that vile. And what McClellan said, especially in talking about the blending of the races, miscegenation, and the campaign he waged against that was appalling beyond belief. As I said, McClellan is someone, yes, he had some strengths, but he was a despicable person. I think one of the worst people. Bruce Caton, the great American historian who wrote a magnificent trilogy on the Army of the Potomac. He talks about the Army being affected throughout the entire of its existence with what was known as McClellanitis. What he meant by that was they were often satisfied with half measures. Okay, so for example at Gettysburg, they won a great tactical victory, but they couldn't end the war by just going hell for leather against Lee and destroying his army. But instead they just said, that's enough. Let him go. If they want to retreat, let him go. That was something that they never fully overcame. And that's one of the reasons why when Grant took over, if you look at Grant's coordinated campaign in 1864, you know, he basically left his subordinate commanders like Sherman and Butler and some of the others to their own devices. Who did he go with? Who did he accompany? The Army of the Potomac, which, contrary to popular belief, was not under Grant's direct command. It was still under the command of George Meade. But Grant went with them because he thought if there's one army that's going to need a kick in the butt to get them moving, it's going to be that army. And so that's why he accompanied.
Right, thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Society, I'd just like to present you with this small token.
Oh, thank you very much. Lovely.
Congratulations.
Excellent.
And we'll ask you to draw the
Oh,
rope.
I'm going to do that.